helping us today. First, we have Lane Tokumoto from DOH. She's in the Department of Developmental Disabilities Division. Hi, Lane. I'm going to wave to everybody. And then we also have Cheryl Matthews, who's a program specialist at DVR. And so we're very thankful for Cheryl as well. We are expecting Lydia Hardy from the Hawaii Disability Rights Center. So hopefully she will pop in just a minute. So if she does, we'll introduce her then as well. So for your information, I am recording this meeting. After this is over, I will email you the recording so that you can have it for your reference. It will also be available on our website, which is www.hawaiiautismfoundation.org. And all of the videos from all of our sessions are available on the website. Also, any resources that our experts share, website links, PDFs, brochures, anything, PowerPoints that they feel is important and they share with you, I will email to you after this meeting. So there's no reason to scramble and write everything down because it will all be sent to you later this afternoon. So the way we do this is you guys submitted questions when you registered. I'll read through those questions and we'll let our experts answer them. If you have additional questions throughout this, or you think of something that hasn't been asked or you would like to ask, just type it in the chat, or you can type your name in the chat and say, I have a question. And that way we can make sure you get recognized because we want to make sure we answer everyone's questions who has one. All right, well, thanks again for being here and we're going to get started. So Lane and Cheryl, if you guys could just real quickly, we had several questions about just what is the difference in services from DOE to DOH. Some people who are on that transition cusp are unclear what the differences in services are, how you qualify for each. Can you just sort of give us a general background of what to expect with each of those?
Go ahead, Lane.
Okay. Hi, my name is Lane Tokumoto, and I'm a social worker from Developmental Disabilities Division. And nice to see some familiar faces in the crowd. Hi, Amanda, that's been, and hi, Abigail. Abigail is my coworker at Developmental Disabilities Division. So, social worker, I'm kind of attached with the clinical and eligibility determination staff. So we support the intake workers who are helping people to apply for our program. So basically, DDD, Developmental Disabilities Division, its focus is really to support participants to receive services to help them in their homes and their communities. So it's a very big picture kind of a focus for our program. Did you want me, Paula, to just already jump into our eligibility criteria?
Yeah, sure, that's fine.
Excuse me, I'm gonna keep talking about it. I'm gonna just show a slide because I think it's a little bit easier for you to see if it's in front of you. Oh, it says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh no. Okay, try now, Lane.
Okay, it's working. All right. So Paula, do you see it?
Yes, we sure do, Lane.
So again, this is very simplified for purposes of presentation, but basically in order to qualify for services from the Developmental Disabilities Division, 3 main criteria have to be met. The applicant has to be a citizen, a resident of Hawaii, and they have to have an intellectual or developmental disability, but as it's defined in the division's administrative rules and revised statute. Okay? So actually, these 2 documents are available on the web. They contain the complete language. Now, I think understanding that the applicant has to be a citizen, resident, that's pretty straightforward. But what I just wanted to spend a moment on is talking about how do we define intellectual or developmental disability. And I think, you know, Paula, because of you're the Hawaii Autism Foundation, I didn't want to spend time on the intellectual disability part, but rather the developmental disability part. Okay, so in having a disability, this is what the applicant has to show us. They actually have to show us that they have a diagnosis of, let's say, autism by a licensed or board certified professional that's recognized by the division. Okay? They also have to have substantial functional limitations in 3 or more of the following areas of major life activity: self-care, receptive and expressive language, learning, mobility, self-direction, capacity for independent living, and economic self-sufficiency. And then lastly, the eligible condition, let's say autism in this case, they have to show us that it occurred during the developmental period. So that would be for developmental disability prior to the age of 22. Okay? So again, citizen, resident, they meet our definition of an intellectual or developmental disability. This is how we define developmental disability. They can show us that they have been diagnosed by a professional with autism. They have substantial functional limitations in 3 or more of the following areas of major life activity. And the disability occurred prior to the developmental period. So that kind of, just in a nutshell, very oversimplified, is how people qualify for the developmental disabilities program. Now, Paula, do you want me to stop here and kind of turn over to Cheryl for DVR's eligibility criteria?
That's up to you guys, however you feel like it's best to share.
Because other than that, Cheryl, I can just go over like the next slide would just be a snapshot of the intake process.
Go ahead.
Okay. So if you are interested in having your child apply for DDD, overview, basically gather information, gather documentation that shows us how you meet these criteria. So like citizen, resident, often a good thing is birth certificate. Okay? Now, in terms of having a developmental disability, if they have a diagnosis of autism, show us a report by your pediatrician, by a psychologist that has that diagnosis. The substantial functional limitations usually are captured in adaptive assessments. These could be done by the school. They would be things like a Violin or an ABAS. Adaptive assessments are usually done by interviewing somebody who knows your child well. You, teacher, a worker at the school. Okay, and then of course, you know, depending on their age, that will be reflected that it occurred prior to the age of 22. Okay? But that's what you want to gather, all that kind of documentation that shows how you meet that criteria. Okay?
Lane, can I ask a question?
Sure.
So in some cases, like in my case with my child with autism, he had a medical diagnosis from a professional at a young age. And then at school, you know, they would generally just re-recognize that every 3 years. We wouldn't go through a whole lot of retesting. So when we were trying to qualify for DDD, one problem we ran into was that his diagnosis was very out of date. And so can you speak to that a little? What is the timeline for how recent does a diagnosis or a re-diagnosis from a doctor or a professional need to be in order to be recognized when they're applying?
You know, that's an excellent question, Paula. I don't know that we have like a hard and fast guideline. I think sometimes, you know, let's say if the child is very young, 2 years old, 3 years old, and they're applying when they're a little bit older, we might just want to get an updated report from their current physician or psychologist. Definitely adaptive assessments, though, this second part, it has to be pretty current, within a year. So, you know, if you're coming to us with something that's adaptive and it was like 3 years ago, we would ask you for an updated one, or we could do it for you. So, you know, it's kind of, again, it's a very good question that you asked, Paula, but I think we take it on a case-by-case basis. Again, some youngsters, they come to us and maybe they don't actually have a diagnosis yet, like maybe a 2-year-old, or it's a provisional diagnosis. So if a lot of time has passed, we might ask for an updated diagnosis.
Okay,
But
thank
it just depends. Yeah, I know that wasn't a very satisfying answer, but it kind of depends on the specific applicant.
Situation, yep.
Thank you.
You know, and then once, you know, the applicant, and again, you know, I'm just applicant, but, you know, if you're helping your child, that's fine. When you think you have enough information, reach out, call. We have offices statewide, so you would just call the office that services where you live. and asked to meet with the intake worker. Okay. At that meeting, you know, we're going to discuss the application process, what's involved, what to expect. You're going to give copies of the documentation. Normally, we've been doing it, of course, in person. We've still been doing intakes throughout the past 2.5 months. We haven't stopped that process. Now we're just kind of doing that initial intake meeting either on the phone or over Zoom. Okay? But we continue to do intake. And then thereafter, you know, the intake worker is going to go to work. They're going to look at what you submitted. They're going to determine if we need any other additional information, and they'll let you know. You know, maybe we do, like in Paula's case, right? She brought what she had. Intake worker determined that, hey, we needed updated report or evaluation. And so, you know, they let Paula know, and then, you know, Paula has to go and get that, or the intake worker can assist the family to get the information that's needed. But this is the intake process in a nutshell. All of you just need to be aware that it takes time. Take several months, so just be prepared and plan accordingly. But that's our intake process in a nutshell. So I'll stop share.
Lane, can you tell me if someone is getting services from the DOE right now, their child is in the DOE, at what point do they need to begin applying for these services? Do they have to wait until their child is out of DOE, or can you start while you're still receiving services?
You can start when you're still in school. Again, we do not have any age restriction on people who apply. So again, we do have people that apply, you know, they're 2 years old. And we have people that apply when they're middle-aged or elderly. So they can apply at any time, provided that there's a need. But I think, you know, in terms of transition planning, which is the topic of today, I think if you're getting maybe within 2 years of graduation, and they're going to think that they want DDD and they want to see if they're eligible, they should start, because as I said, it can take time to determine if they're eligible, and if they're eligible, to then receive services.
Thank you.
Sure.
Can you tell, someone asked, what other services, as I'm looking at transferring into adulthood, transitioning into adulthood, what other services might I need to apply for? I mean, Social Security, getting handy van services, things like that. Can you sort of speak to other things that parents might need to be looking into besides applying through the DOH?
And I might actually have to ask for help from the audience, because those are all good things that you mentioned. Again, if they're needing health insurance, some financial resources, and definitely Medicaid, and that's going to become very important if they are eligible for our program and would like to receive services, having that Medicaid health insurance, social SSI, supplemental security income, transportation, handy van, those are all good.
Okay, thank you. Can you explain the Medicaid waiver for people who may not be familiar with it? That was a new concept to me. I know when we were starting this process, that we needed to apply for the waiver as well as these services, so that when he qualified, there would be someone to pay for it. You know, it would go through. So can you explain the waiver to people who may not be familiar?
Sure. You know, so, you know, what I just went over with you is how to kind of get your foot in the door, as I would say, into the Developmental Disabilities Division, right? How to apply, see if you're going to be eligible for case management services, to be assigned a case manager. So for that, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back and share screen again. So that's almost like the first step, right? To be eligible for, Developmental Disabilities Division, citizen, resident, intellectual or developmental disability as defined in our statute and our administrative rules. It says nothing about age, and again, that's why, Paula, you know, applicants can apply at any age. It depends on what their need is, right? It doesn't say anything about health insurance, okay? Now, however, if they meet this criteria, they enter and they're eligible for DDD, and they said, okay, now what, right? We're in, we have a case manager, what services can we receive from DDD? Well, the majority of people that apply for DDD are interested in getting services that come from our Medicaid IDD waiver. And just so you know, What this is, it's an alternative to long-term institutionalized care. So in order to be eligible for waiver services, families have to kind of go through a second intake process, which is what Paula experienced, right? Now you're in DDD, you have a case manager, you said, hey, I would like to go to an adult day health program, or get respite, or get personal assistance. Well, those are all services through our waiver program. But now we have to make sure that the child, the adult, is eligible for waiver. To be eligible for waiver, they have to be in our program, of course. They have to be Medicaid eligible. So Medicaid eligible is overseen by the Department of Human Services. We're the Department of Health. Medicaid is health insurance for people with low income, low assets, right? So they do have to apply for Medicaid and be determined eligible, because as Paula said, that's what's going to pay for the services. And then lastly, they have to meet a level of care criteria, because again, waiver is an alternative to long-term institutionalized care. So they have to meet that institutionalized level of care criteria. And that's going to be determined by getting information from the child's physician and submitting it to the Department of Human Services. So they're actually going to oversee these two steps, determining if your child has Medicaid, eligible for Medicaid, excuse me, and if they meet the level of care criteria. So this is the requirements for Medicaid IDD waiver. If they're eligible, here's our menu of services. These are all done through contracted providers. So in order to receive a service, there has to be a provider willing to provide the service.
We have a question from the chat that asks if there is an income limit for parents when applying for Medicare, Medicaid.
You know, when the child is a minor living in the home and you're applying for Medicaid for the child, and again, I'm sorry, this is not my area of expertise. So if anybody else in the audience is more familiar, like Cheryl, please step in. But then everybody's income and assets will be considered. Again, when the child is a minor living in the home. I think once the child hits a certain age, it might be 18, even if the child is still living in the home, then only their income and only their assets are considered. But I think so when they're a minor living in the home, and you have to consider everybody's income and assets, so they Medicaid might have to do something to make them, deem them eligible. And I do apologize, I can't speak on deeming.
Medicaid has its own eligibility requirements, and I believe when the child turns 18, unless guardianship is in play, the child, the young adult's assets are only considered at that point. But things are changing on a pretty regular basis at this point, so they're wanting to ensure, I think, more and more qualify for Medicaid under the current environment that we're in. So the best thing to do, if in doubt, just apply. I've had one parent who applied not believing that her daughter was eligible for Medicaid and was able to take her employer-sponsored insurance down to a single payer from a two-party payer. So, you know, the impacts on family resources are really compounded when they're able to diversify their income, you know, and their cash flow that way, when they can get these resources from another provider from the state.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I also would say, just from personal experience, we moved from out of state, from the mainland, as my child was transitioning from DOE to DOH. And so my experience is a little different. We did not start in DOE here in Hawaii. But I will say that I could have saved myself and my family a lot of time if I had applied for DDD and Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security simultaneously, instead of waiting for one step to be done and then going to the next step. And it's because I just wasn't educated on how the system worked. But I think that for those of you who are starting that process, who it's helpful to do it all at once, because none of them are quick processes. And so it will shorten your wait time considerably if you do it all together. So that would be my advice for that. I do have a question. There are some people in our group who applied for DDD services who their child did not qualify for DDD. And their question is, are there programs available? It's a two-part question. First, are there programs available for people who do not qualify for DDD? Are there any resources for those people? And then the second part of the question is, if this person doesn't agree with that decision, what are the recourses that they can take?
Okay.
You know, I think depending on the age of the applicant, what's available other than DDD.
It's an adult, I do know that. It's an adult in his 20s.
So honestly, what's available other than DDD and DVR, very limited. I mean, there might be and I see Cheryl shaking her head, there might be a program here or there, but their focus is going to be very limited. It's not going to be as comprehensive as Developmental Disabilities Division. As I said, you know, we're kind of that big picture program. How do we support people long-term in their homes and in their community? So unfortunately, if they're not eligible for us and they're an adult, it's going to be very limited what's available.
So
Is
national data, I'm sorry, Paula,
No, go
national
ahead.
data states that only 25% of individuals with ID actually are receiving services from the Department of Health or DD nationwide. And so what happens to that other 75% of those individuals that don't qualify for Department of Health DD services? One of the challenges that VR is faced with under the new Workforce Innovations and Opportunities Act that was passed in 2014 is to address this gap group, what the federal RSA is claiming as a gap group. In other words, that 75% population that I referred to earlier that aren't receiving any kind of support services through the DD division. And that's where they have charged DVR to provide 15% of our federal allocation dollars towards this target population, students with disabilities as well as youth. So a student with a disability are those aged between 14 and 22, the day before they turn 22, enrolled in an educational program, whether it's secondary or post-secondary. Then the youth with a disability ranging from 14 to 24. So we have this pocket of dollars to actually target students with a disability, but we have a subset of focus on youth. So once that student emerges and working with that IEP team, we're an outside agency, so we depend on parents to ask for VR's presence at the IEP meeting and request VR services in order to begin that process. We like to start them as early as 14 because the sooner we can get a relationship and that rapport and that trust factor built and developed with the student and the family, the more likely we are going to be able to assist them when they're ready to actually make that transition. My personal goal is that not all of our students stay in school until 22. Now, we can't make that a blanket statement out there, but that should be the goal of every family. If their child is capable of leaving the DOE and all of those wraparound services, where our counselors come in and help and assist is identifying what those resources are needing to be to help the family make that successful transition. And we've got the captive audience while they're in school with the DOE team as that support base to help us navigate all of those resources and what the challenges actually are. They usually are pre-ET services for our potentially eligible clients are limited to 5 services, and I'll speak to those in a few minutes. But our VR services are where our individualized services come in, and working with that counselor to help move them from a potentially eligible category where they're receiving just those 5 limited services in terms of moving them over to receiving more of those individualized services, to helping them identify just exactly what has been the challenge. Where are those resources? Where in the community can we get the assistance? But it all starts for us really starting at 14, targeting those incoming freshmen with, are they wanting to work later on? And if so, how do we get them prepared during this 5, 6, 7, maybe up to 8 years of working with the DOE team to migrate them out appropriately, and ensuring that they're receiving the kinds of supports that they actually need to be successful and as independent to their fullest potential.
Okay, thank you. I want to follow up on one part of the question for this specific person. If someone applied for DDD services several years ago and was denied, their child didn't qualify, and they feel like things may have changed a little bit, situation has changed, is there a reapplication process, or is there a process where she can disagree with the decision of DDD? Can you go through that a little bit for parents who may need to look at other options?
Sure. So definitely, if somebody applies and they are determined to not be eligible, important for the families to just make sure they understand why your child was not eligible. Intake workers should explain the reason why. You will also get a letter with information in terms of how you did not meet our criteria. Now, if you disagree, like Paula was saying, the letter will contain information on how you can appeal, informally or formally. So at that time, and it's time limited. So if you do want to seek that option, you just need to work on it quickly. But you can meet with either staff within our division or within the Department of Health, and you can explain why you disagree. So that's one thing. You can seek to appeal. If you understand why your child was not eligible, but you go away and things change, like Paula said, then you can reapply at a later time. So just because we say no once doesn't mean it's no forever. As time goes by, if your child changes, things change, you have new information, please reapply. But they do have to go through the reapplication process again. So calling to make an appointment with the intake worker, submitting the new information. But yes, that is definitely an option.
Thank you. Okay, our next question was about the transition section of IEPs. Someone wanted to know, how detailed does that transition section need to be? I know from teaching special education for a number of years, seeing people's transition sections that can vary widely from school to school, from district to district. And so how detailed should a parent insist on it being? Either of you have any insight on that?
I don't have any insight on that because it's all individually based. And those decisions are made by the IEP team as a whole. And like you said, will vary from school to school, even within a district. So because they are individualized based, I'm just not confident in giving any one specific detail that it should be, Amanda, do you have any insight to how specific that section should be as a parent?
No, it's really unique to the student, but I mean, I think the question is like, we don't know, right? We don't know what should go in here. I've asked questions. I don't always get an answer that I can understand. And Ikaika is 16, and we're just now starting to really fill that section out, and I still don't understand, all of what goes in each of the boxes and how they're related to each other. So I'm sorry, we're in transition right now, and I'm still daily struggling to comprehend what goes in those boxes and how I support him and how the school supports him at the same time.
I'll share a little bit of experience just as a special education teacher. I will say that it really is, it should be about the individual child. That's what the whole purpose of an IEP is, right? Your transition section should not look exactly like your neighbor's, but that I do think that one mistake that people make when doing the transition is not making it comprehensive enough. We really, for my personal child, which is the only one I can talk about, really expanded that section, not just for work skills and communication skills and the things that you think of that he will need as an adult, but for just living skills. Like they taught him how to do his own laundry. They taught him how to put things back up where they go, you know, at home. All of those had to be goals that we had to write in. And so I think now is a really unique time when you're home so much with your child. There are things that I thought my kiddo was really good at that I have learned that not so much, right? You know, now that I see him in this situation all of the time. And so now is a good time. So when you go back, if you're working on that transition section, say, you know what I realized is that my kid doesn't know how to, you know, tell if the food in the refrigerator is expired before he fixes a sandwich, doesn't know how to, you know, cook this or cut this or tell me when he's out of toothpaste, you know, whatever. You realize you can put things like that in the IEP so that they can work on independent living skills, which is an important part of transition, not just the jobs, not just the adult work life. And I do think that IEPs in that transition section tend to focus just on the work life and not the independent living skills, and just what will they need to be a happy, as well-adjusted adult and as independent as they can be. So that's my 2 cents with that. Our next question is, are there specific programs in the DOE that help with transition to adulthood? Like, are there programs that are maybe options parents can take a part of? And does anyone know if there are programs the DOE or DOH offers that can be accessed by people in private school? And I'll open that to the whole group. Amanda or Susan, I don't know if you would know that. Hold on, Susan, you're still on mute.
Would you repeat the question? I got a half of it.
Oh, sure. Yes. Do you know if there are programs for people that parents can access that might have children in private school, or programs through the DOE or DOH that parents can access that would help with transition that may not be something everybody knows about? You know, like, is there, I know someone mentioned that in an old district, I don't believe it was here, that there was a class offered for relationships that parents could opt into, like, you know, how my child is starting to get interested romantically and is not dealing with that appropriately, right? And there's a class, almost like a sex ed class for people with developmental disabilities that was offered through a private organization in their community. That, do you know of anything that could help parents with transitions?
Well, we still have the Jobs Now Partnership grant going at the Center on Disability Studies. And although their target population was the leeward schools, they've included anybody that wants to be included in their workshops and outreach. And the contact person is Chin Ho, and I can look up his email and put it in the box. There is an annual transition fair called Footsteps to Transition Fair. And Amanda and I and many of the people on this call have worked on that for at least 6 or 7 years. It's a shared hosting between the Department of Education and family serving agencies. And it shifts, it's only on Oahu, although there are some comparable events on neighbor islands, but the one on Oahu moves from district to district. So this year it's moving back to Honolulu district, I believe. It's typically a half a day. It's a resource fair. And there's a wonderful talk featuring Leo Parlin from Hilo Pa'a. I was mentioning in the chat, she has some really nice materials, but that used to be available free to anybody that wanted them. It's kind of a template for planning. And I don't see it on their revised website, but I'm sure that they could offer that to anybody that called or emailed them. Because there are, in addition to what DOE plans for and DDD plans for and BVR plans for, there's a lot of areas that families aren't tuned into, like having to register your male son for the draft, even though he's not likely to be drafted. So, and we don't have a current draft, but you still have to go through that exercise of contacting that federal agency and letting them know about your kid. The SPIN conference used to be a great place to have transition discussions, but we're on hold until we can get all together. But just keep your ear to the grindstone and just kind of, I know HAF puts out good information, and we try to do it at SPIN, and other agencies do, DD Council. So just keep tuned in. We have resources on what families need to know about their educational rights during transfer of rights, because once their kids turn 18, if they're intellectually disabled and really can't advocate for themselves, and the parent has chosen not to be a guardian, which I have chosen with my kiddo, there are still two options that they can use to maintain their right to advocate in an IEP meeting. One being a power of attorney, if their kiddo knows what that means. Many kids don't. And the second is called an educational representative, and it's a very easy document to obtain that just indicates the person doesn't have the ability to make good informed choices, and so somebody is going to speak up for him, and typically that's the parent.
Right.
So we have those documents. If anybody wants general information, they can always ask SPIN, and we can send out what we have.
Those are on the SPIN website, Susan?
Some are and some aren't. Some you have to ask for.
Okay.
But
I think those would be really helpful. We had several questions from people about guardianship, power of attorney, what should I do? Who do I talk to? How do we even start? That can be an expensive process too, for some people. And so there are lots of different options, and we're still feeling that out at my house, trying to decide what the best thing is for our child. But it's not something to be entered into lightly. And I think the more information people have, the better. So anything that you could share with us, I would love to share with the group. I would appreciate that, Susan.
And I would just say that guardianship is not inevitable. And there are a lot of schools that are pushing it, but there are a lot of alternatives to guardianships that families can consider. So as you mentioned, it's expensive and it requires annual reporting, and it basically takes the rights away from an individual. So there are some other options for many families. Thanks for letting me say my pitch.
No, it's really important. And you answered about 3 questions from people unintentionally. So thank you for doing that. All right, we have several questions, Lane and Cheryl, about adult programs or resources on neighbor islands. It's a lot easier to find resources here on Oahu, obviously, but do you have any suggestions for people of resources on the outer islands?
Well, I do know that Hawaii Disability Rights Center is available statewide, and I think that they're always a really good source of information, particularly if you're looking at educational rights, power of attorney versus guardianship. Although they cannot help you with that process, they can definitely be a very good, accurate source of information because it involves the legal aspects. And then they can also help you with getting an advocate to actually how specific do we need to be involved with this transition piece in meeting the needs of your child as they, you know, their journey through the educational system. And then I would also like to acknowledge we have here on Oahu access to independence. We also have Aloha Independent, those two agencies here on Oahu. But all of our AJCs statewide have also partnered with DVR to actually provide employment types of training programs for the students and the youth also. And they're available statewide.
I think all I will add is just from DDD's perspective is we do provide services statewide. Of course, the most providers, because you know all of our waiver services are through contracted providers. The majority are on Oahu. So some of the services that I showed you in that slide might be limited on the neighbor islands, but theoretically they exist, and we have case managers servicing all the islands.
And then I would also recommend that parents really consider realistic goals for their young person. And with DVR, our eligibility criteria wraps around, we're looking at 7 different areas with regards to functional limitations. We're looking at communication, mobility, interpersonal skills, work skills, their work tolerance, their ability to care for themselves, as well as to take and be self-directed. And so as the state's employment agency for persons with disabilities, when we're looking at moving our participants into and our consumers into employment, we're really trying to help them be as independent as possible. And so if you consider your own employment journey, it's very unlikely that an employer will hire 2 people to do the work of one individual. So when we bring on a second individual to assist our clients with like job coaching services, I'm speaking directly to, we're looking at the possibility that this individual may need some assistance, but ultimately they're going to be able to perform on the job independently and be able to go day to day through a regular shift on their own. And so with regards to how specific you want those goals to be within that transition piece, I would really encourage you to consider these 7 different areas and how you can help at home develop these areas with your own student. Because ultimately, if employment is your goal for them, that's what the employer is going to expect from them.
Thank you very much. It's really helpful information. We're about out of time, but you guys have been super helpful, and I really appreciate all of the feedback and all of the questions. Very good questions. I learned several things today, so thank you for that. I do want to remind you that I recorded this and will send you the recording later this afternoon, along with Lane's PowerPoint. Lane, if you don't mind sharing that with me from later, and all of the resources that were mentioned here, including the ones that were mentioned in the chat. So Susan and Amanda shared some resources from SPIN. I'll include those with their permission, if that's okay. I'll include those as well in the follow-up email, and you guys will have access to all of that. The video recording and most of the resources will also be on our website, hawaiiautism.com. I do want to paste really quickly over in the chat my email address here. If you have ideas for future ones of these, we've done several on different topics, but we always want to host sessions that will be helpful to people, that will answer questions that you need answered. And so if you have an idea, please feel free to email me, and we will do our very best to find answers to your questions or to find experts who can answer the questions if we can't do it. And I've also included the link for our Talk Story session. On Fridays, we do a social group for people with developmental and intellectual disabilities, all ages. And it's just a fun little time that we do sometimes a show and tell. Last week we played bingo. Sometimes we do like an art project together. It's very casual, and it's just an opportunity for non-judgmental socialization through Zoom. And so there's the sign up link. It's also on our Facebook page, and we would love for you to join us if you can. And again, I want to thank Lane and Cheryl. You've been super helpful, and we appreciate your time, and I hope everyone stays well and has a good week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.